Hello, this is David Collister with Time to Remember. On today's programme, we hear the remarkable story of Jinny the Witch from Hampton Creer.
Hop, Junie, tra-la-lay. Winnie the Witch went over the house to get the stick to beat the mouse. Hop, Junie, tra-la-lay.
Hop Tuné, or Halloween as it's better known to many, is one of the strongest of Manx folk traditions. The song itself tells of Jinny the Witch, though in that particular version by the children of Arbury Street School, she's become Winnie the Witch. Hampton Creer has discovered through dedicated research that she was a real person. We'll come to her alleged misdoings and subsequent trial shortly. But first I asked Hampton Creer how prevalent witchcraft might have been on the Isle of Man.
Claims that medieval witches were nailed in barrels and sent hurtling down the steep Llewelyn hillside, or tied in sacks and thrown in the Curraglass at Grebe, are usually dismissed because no proof exists. But recently I came across a presentment at St Germans in 1666 which satisfied my mind that Llewelyn was probably the scene of executions like that. Given a well-made barrel, it would be airborne going down the hill, and the woman would mercifully be dead in very short time.
A spiked barrel or not?
No, it wouldn't be needed. I don't think so. No, the story was that if she survived, it was thrown as trial by ordeal. She was pronounced a witch and executed. And if she died, well, she hadn't been a witch after all. And found no evidence of ducking stools. They're used widely in England. They sound comical, but witches placed on them usually drowned.
What was a ducking stool as such?
In every parish in England had one, and for nagging wives and all this sort of thing, they would be tied to them and ducked in the village lake in pond. Yeah. But it got out of hand when witchcraft really got into full swing in medieval times. It resulted in tragedy.
What sort of things then would you say that someone would be pronounced as a witch for? What would they be doing?
Mainly the Manx witches. Really, there were only 2 or 3 that I found anyway. They were vagrants who were roaming the island, begging food. Around the 1640s, the island was starving. People were starving to death on the island, and if they went round to a house and scrounging food, and if they were refused, they threatened to put the bad eye on the person or the house or their family. And if anything, when an animal died or somebody took ill, they got the blame, and it all got going from there really. And but yet only one recorded Manx woman was Margaret Quain, and she's confirmed to have suffered death by being burned at the stake. The reason for her conviction remains uncertain, but historians here tend to feel that she was blamed for the bad weather and the growing crops, for the failure of the harvest.
Is there a date for that?
Yes, 1617 is not a precise date, 1617, and his a young son too he'd done nothing, had been tied on a heap of dry heather to experience an unimaginably horrible death of means of execution.
Do we know where on the island that happened?
Yes, in Castletown. There is, I think there's still there, a plaque marking the spot in Castletown, and it said that their screams could be heard at Ballasalla, and the Manx nation was stunned by the sheer horror of what had been seen. The ecclesiastical authorities were forced by public opinion to rule that such a spectacle must never take place on the island again, and it never did. But as you will see, the refusal to take human life of the Manx infuriated our lords and masters, the Lord of Man. This led to the prisoners under capital sentences being put in Castle Rushen, and literally the key thrown away. Some of them were there 20 years, and by 1692 there were 19. And this resulted in Lord Derby becoming furious, and he sent a letter to his officials on the island that they were to be given a chance that either execution was to take place or they were to be given the chance of life transportation to the Jamaica plantations. My great-grand-stepmother was one of the prisoners who went on that. She'd stolen 2 lambs, but some of the prisoners who went on it were innocent. But anyway, that's another story.
Is there any evidence of what kind of treatment they had there in Castle Rushen?
Oh, brutal treatment. It's in Never to Return. You'll see actual records of their treatment, whippings, severe whippings, and they were obviously in a bad way when they set foot on board the ship. And as far as we can tell, we know the ship got to Jamaica safely, but all the prisoners apparently must have died on the voyage.
Yes.
It was during the Tudor period, that the punishments of witches reached incredible levels. An Act of Parliament extended capital punishment to those merely suspected of being witches, with the result that in less than a century, more than 30,000 English and Scottish witches, sorcerers, charmers and wizards ended their lives by being choked on the gallows or burned alive in public executions. People's imaginations ran riot. Women who had been seen in the vicinity of an animal's sudden death were liable to be arrested on suspicion of being a witch.
Really?
Yeah, they were interrogated intensely by the clergy, and usually they were simple, illiterate women easily made into making or marking confessions they didn't understand.
Yes.
They
With
were
a cross, presumably.
Yes, they were. That was part of it, and the whole thing got out of hand. Even King Henry VIII accused his wife of Anne Boleyn of being a witch because she had 6 fingers on her left hand.
Yes.
In witch hunts, were virtually unknown on the island. In England, an old woman would ride on a slow-moving cart drawn through the streets, and she could point to any woman she thought looked of witch-like appearance, and the unfortunate individual was then seized. The old, the disfigured, the handicapped, and mentally and physically were in great danger. The hair grown on the face, a squint, mumbling to oneself, a stammer, were sufficient to see them taken away. England even had a witch finder general.
Yes, of course.
The whole thing got more out of hand. But the Manx witches were just generally vagrants.
They were just unfortunates, really.
That's right, yes. There were 3 witchcraft trials on the island worth talking about, really. There was Margaret Quain, who was burned at the stake, we've just talked about. And then there was Jane Caesar. She was an exception to the rule. She was no vagrant. She was the wife of an MHK from Ballyhick, and she was accused of changing into a hare and all sorts of things, and she was additionally accused of drowning a neighbour's cat in the sea to cause the wind to change so her friend's boat could get back to the sea. Get back to the shore.
It's hard to imagine these things happening.
In 1712, an elderly lady found herself imprisoned after she offered to fly to Scotland if she was given 2 new pewter plates to use for that purpose. She was released on the grounds, quote, that travelling through the air constituted no offence. That was on the island here. The first Monday of each quarter was especially important amongst witches because the smoke from their chimneys was supposed to travel in the opposite direction from the wind. Tramming trees, Ballinbane, killing a black rooster, then dragging it around their farmyards, tying yellow flowers to the cattle's tails and taking herbs formed just part of the defences against witchcraft.
Some of the people on the island still do some of those things today.
Oh yes, charming is still, to lots of people, they swear by it. So anyway, that's a personal thing, it's up to them. It enriches the story of the island, history of the island, if nothing else. In 1820, a distant relative of mine, Catherine Green, was a noted war charmer. She described Mrs. Luthwaite's book, Fleece and Flail United, from Union Mills. Catherine's patients were told to walk up the Lurgy Crippity and put with some oats, which they'd wrapped in a paper, and throw the package over the hedge. By the time the oats had sprouted, hey presto, the oats had gone. They tend to be ridiculed now, but most farms had and lots of ordinary houses too, would have a tramman tree at the back door to keep the evil spirits away. Because I remember we had one over here on the farm, and when a new barn needed to be built, none of the staff would take and cut the tramman tree down.
That's an old tradition, isn't it?
Considered bad luck. I think JCB made short work of it in the end. But I think myself that the dark had a lot to do with it. It was 1950s before there was any electric up at the Cool here, and when you were a youngster and you were shut away in your bedroom in a cold, unheated farmhouse at night, and the moving shadows on the curtains. I mean, were they with someone in the room with you, or was it? It was a frightening experience in those days with no electric. Today's youngsters they just flick of a light, and there it's instant available. My mother was brought up at Belelby in Derby, and she used to tell how her 11 brothers and sisters would hold hands to climb the candlelit stairs on their way to bed, having just sat around the fireside and listened to a nightly diet of weird and incredible happenings of long ago. Spooks, begans, Zoroasters, all the rest of it. There was no TV. Derby was, of course, more famous than anywhere else in the world for spooks. Yeah. So anyway, we come on to the greatest witch of them all. This was Joni Lowney. In my opinion, she was the most famous Manx person who's ever lived.
So we come on to the person now that was known as Jinny the Witch.
That's right. She was Joni Lowney of Braddon. Theories have abounded over the centuries as to who she was. People on the north claim she came emerged from a bog in Ballaugh, and she had green teeth. To others, she came from Cheshire. Some said she originated on the continent and literally flew in here with her sisters. But no, Joni Lowney was Manx. One of my fellow members of the Isle Family History Society spotted a trial in Douglas at which she was involved. She was accused, and it led to doing a lot of research on Joni Lowney, and I was astonished to find that my great-grandparents times 7 were involved as well. They were key witnesses, and really, I searched the island, at the Manx Museum Library, looking for Joni Lowney, who fitted everything. And there were an awful lot of blind alleyways, but eventually I found the answer was right under my nose. In the end, she was living on the Mount Murray back road, just up the road here, and I found that her reign of terror, really, I suppose you could call it, she ranged from Cueg Mill to Ballacallan and Marown, and this trial was the culmination of all sorts of accusations against her of causing great troubles. But anyway, let's just go back to the beginning. She was on trial at Bishop's Court on June the 1st, 1715. This was Mr. David Crane, M.A., the late David Crane, who was a brilliant Manx historian, found this, and she was accused of cursing and leading a wicked life. At the end, she was, like most of them, quote, hath promised reformation. But it was during this trial that a Santon man apparently told her one stormy evening he had called at a house seeking lodging as it was getting dark. It was Joni's house. He was taken inside. Shortly after going to bed, he saw Joni in the glow of the fire. There was a sage, S-A-A-G-H, or a vessel, on the floor, and it began to move, and Joni, quote, went into it. Soon after, whoosh! Both Joni and the sage flew out of the house, leaving the astonished man and Joni's family behind. She did not return, quote, until the following morning with plenty of fishes. Now, if you think about the song, Jinny, they used to sing on this side of the island. Jinny the Witch went over the house, flew over the house to get the stick to lather the mouse. Hop tune a. My mother's gone away and she won't be back until the morning. Yeah. There it is. That's where that's come from.
Yes.
From the moment the man told of this, the greatest and craziest of all Manx legends was born. Joni had aviation capabilities, and anyway, I don't know what Joni had given the man for his supper that night, but there was probably an innocent explanation to what had happened. More than likely, he dreamed the whole thing, and when he saw her returning with fishes, she was probably just coming from Douglas after buying fish from the fishing boats landing their catch at dawn. Dr. Larchgarrett has stated that many people in those times took herbs and plants for ailments and, I suppose, food and all sorts of things, which distorted their minds. There's probably nothing more to the whole thing than that. But news of her exploits spread like wildfire. Long, in my view, long may it continue and delight Manx children. But Joni did not reform, and 2 years later she faced the biggest witchcraft trial ever at Douglas before Bishop Wilson himself, accompanied by the hierarchy of the powerful church, sitting in an ecclesiastical court on the 4th and 5th of November 1716. Here's a summary of the evidence recorded. The 3 defence witnesses were heard first. Mr. Kermode of Ballamiddle told how his servant was at Quegg Mill, having corn ground into meal. Joni Lowney was there and remarked to Mr. Kermode that the horse he was holding was, as a Manxman would say, only maul. But on being told that the animal would eat neither corn nor grass, Joni took some meal, uttered some words over it, and gave it to the horse, which rapidly recovered and, quote, did eat provender. Later in 1712, my great-grandfather and great-grandmother times 7, Catherine and Christian Hampton, were in a state of desperation because their son Thomas was gravely ill on the farm here, and with no medical help available, went against all church teaching and sent for Joni, who lived close by. When she arrived, she examined the child and told his parents he was in a critical state, and she seemed reluctant to become involved. Catherine pleaded with Joni Lowney, quote, for to try her skill upon the sick child. Again, she told him that the baby was lying in a heavy acade, A-C-H-A-E-D, a fever, and if he died, not to blame her. Some water was requested, over which she said some strange words, and was given to the baby. The water, Joni said, was very heavy, indicating the child was near death. I don't know how long it took, but Thomas made a complete recovery and lived at Ballabunt to a great age, the father of 12 children.
That in itself is an extraordinary situation, because you're talking there about charms, aren't you?
Yes, charming. It was just as serious as witchcraft. Yeah. But we'll come on to more serious witchcraft in a minute. Christopher himself gave further support. He was very ill once. She was sent for once again, and she gave him some ale, and after drinking some, Christopher recovered. This is all evidence taken from the great trial in Douglas. Yeah. It's perfectly recorded. As a descendant of them, find it pleasing that Christopher and Catherine didn't forget the efforts of Joni Lowney when they heard she faced trial. Indeed, it is likely their evidence was the deciding factor as to whether or not Jinny the Witch would hang. Joni's supporters, however, were few compared to the dozens who came forward and blamed her for a reign of terror and destruction. They believed she had wreaked in Braddon and Marown for more than a decade. Here is a sample. Anne Cretney of Stugadoo at the Braid told how Joni came to her house asking for some milk. None was available, and so as she left, Joni passed Mrs. Cretney's herd of cows. One of them best cows immediately fell down and could not be made to stand despite the efforts of 8 men to lift her. Joni Lowney's young daughter found it all hilarious and sat on the hedge laughing. Tempers flared. Mrs. Cretney declared, quote, Joni to have been the author of what had happened, as she always had an ill name. There's probably a cow head with what they call staggers now, and today it's treated with calcium injection. Mr. Thomas Cubban told the court that there was a common saying that if anybody denied Joni Lowney, they got no good by it. Christopher Kinley testified that he became one dark night he became aware that someone or something was standing close to him. Nervously he called out at who it was. It is I, the great witch, the great sister, was roared back at him. It was Joni, and doubtless Christopher took to his heels. She was now openly confessing that she was the arch witch, obviously enjoying her island-wide fame and frightening the living daylight out of everybody. John Gelling of Clyben at the Cool explained how one day he was tending his sheep when Joni and her young son passed by. The boy had a dog which began pestering the sheep. Mr. Gelling asked why they couldn't pass by as other people did, and began to beat the dog with a stick, thus upsetting the child. Joni intervened, telling Farmer Gelling she would be even with him. That night both his oxen died. He felt certain the action had been the action of a witch, Joni, the ill character she always went by. Jane Corran told how she was at William Cubban's house in Ballacubban, Braddon, combing wool. Joni Lowney came begging and was given alms but didn't go away. In fact, the shady visitor stayed until dark. When dinner was placed in front of everyone seated at the table, Joni sat on the floor and seemed startled when Mrs. Cubban took the precaution of placing, quote, the tongs in the fire in her name. Joni asked why she did this, and Mrs. Cubban told her that she always heard that Joni Lowney was a witch. The tongs remained in the fire until after Joni had gone. Hardly surprisingly, Mrs. Cubban suffered a long illness shortly after. Mrs. Cubban told her servant told that he had requested the tongs be taken out of the fire for fear of antagonising Joni, and later his master asked him to move the sheep to shelter. He found 10 so feeble that they could not stand. Next day all 10 lay dead in a puddle of water. The evil character Joni Lowney was suspected. Probably this was just pulpy kidney disease. Mrs. Cubban told how at Easter Joni had come to their house and was given alms She also demanded ale, but Mr. Cubbon told her that she had none. Joni said a neighbour told her she did have some. Next day, Mr. Cubbon found his best cow dead. The only cause he knew of was the farra, the wicked practices of Joni Lowney. Farra was, quote, those who delight in sorcery involving cattle or sacrifice. It went on. Thomas Callan told her he had been gravely ill, and in his fever saw the similitude of Joni. Christian Stephen claimed Joni offered him the farra of a neighbour. The long trial entered its closing stages at Balaglony on Murray Back Road. Joni, who lived about 200 yards away, arrived and asked for some milk. They were churning that milk into butter. Joni was told if she waited she could have some. Joni was furious and stormed off, saying, "You shall have milk enough before I come again." All day the Crane family continued churning, but the milk could not be brought, quote, to any perfection, merely turning into cheese and cream, quite useless. It was Joni Lowney that had caused it. But her most spectacular feat was the one that ended her career. Took place at Belafton Corn Mill, beyond the Saddle Road, known as the Bishop's Mill. This Bishop Wilson's miller, William Corran, was there, told the court he was grinding wheat into flour from distribution among the poor when Joni Lowney arrived. She criticised the miserable quality of the grain and became infuriated. There was a crowd there, and she publicly rebuked Bishop Wilson by telling Mr. Corran that the poor should be served of the best. Incidentally, the millers often reserved the rubbishy grain for the poor.
Yes.
That's the expression, grinding poverty. Mr. Corran explained that although she stood some distance from the mill, Joni stopped it dead. What kind of a person could do that? Not only that, but the machinery could never be made to work again. The destroyed mill was the property of the very man now facing Joni in court as a judge. It had been a disastrous mistake, and it must have been this incident that led to Bishop Wilson finally ordering Joni's arrest and trial. Such was the importance that months passed before the jury returned a guilty verdict. The little nation must have held its breath, speculating as to whether Jinny the Witch would hang. It didn't look good for her as she languished in St. Germans prison, because the jury added, I think they called her rider now, for her crimes of charms, sorcery, and other wicked and diabolical practice tending very much to witchcraft. She deserves to be punished. It was at Douglas in February 1717 that Bishop Wilson delivered the sentence in an impressive manner. He considered that Joni Lowney has utterly abandoned herself to the highest degree of impiety by practising for many years several kinds of sorcery, charms, and other diabolical means tending to witchcraft, by which she has not only captivated a soul, but also deluded and ensnared many ignorant people, and ye said offender, seeming to be utterly insensible of her wickedness. It is therefore highly necessary to treat her with an uncommon degree of rigour, in order to save her, if possible, from perishing eternally. She is there to hereby censured to 14 days close imprisonment in St. Germans, to penance in all ye churches and chapels of this isle in ye most solemn manner, to confess her abominable crimes and pray God and her church's forgiveness. After which he is to stand at ye 4 market crosses in sackcloth, with a white wand in her hand and paper on her breast, on which are to be the words in capital letters, for practices in sorcery and witchcraft. And it went on. She was also to be fined £3 when she was released from St. Germans.
So that was, I suppose, in those times, and with the accusations that were made, the most gentle sentence he could give, perhaps, was it?
Oh yes, she was desperately lucky. Had this happened in England, she would certainly have gone to the gallows. Bishop Wilson was a man renowned for mercy, as I've said, except perhaps to Catherine Conrad, whom he ordered to be dragged by the hair around Peel Bay, so her soul may be cleansed, because she had an illegitimate child. And she was very lucky. It was him that presided over the case, because his view was that witches should be ignored and their judgment left to God alone.
That was fairly enlightened, wasn't it?
It was. It was a very modern view of it, really. Yeah. And perhaps a concern for baby Thomas Hampton saved her life. I'll never know. But it would certainly have ended on the gallows in England or Scotland. Jinny the Witch's reign was over. Joni Lowney died in January 1725 and is buried at Old Kirkbraden.
Now, what about her descendants, if any?
Oh, I've never gone.
not
into
researched
she had
that.
She had 6 children. I've never gone into that. No,
Somebody must do
there were
that.
a number of so many Joni Lowneys in the island at that time. It took a lot of tracking down to find the right one.
Yeah.
So whether there are any descendants, I honestly don't know. But
Now, the song itself, then, there was different versions of it, was there?
yes, all over the island. I think I referred earlier to here. Kids used to sing "Jinny the Witch went over the house to get the stick to lather the mouse." Hop Junay. My mother's gone away and she won't be back until the morning,
Yes.
which fits in with the trial. I can't remember all the rest of it. But on the north, do you want me to read this?
Well, I think so. This is this is part of the northern version.
Yeah,
isn't
this is
it?
the northern version. Put in the pot, put in the pan. I scalded my throat. I feel it yet. I ran to the well. I drank my fill. What did you see there? I saw a polecat. The cat began to grin, and I began to run. Jinny the Winnie came out of the lake, a griddle in her hand, all ready to bake. Her teeth were green, her eyes were red, and a thickness of hair at her upon her head. Baking bonnets, toasting sconnings, I asked her for a bit. Guess the bit she gave me, a bit as big as my toe. I dipped it in milk and then lapped it in silk and went home by the light of the moon. This was sung in Peel on Old Hollandtide Eve, November the 11th.
The songs, then, must have been composed shortly after these events took place?
Yes, it would be. If it was a great thing to compose songs, not only here on the island here, but if you take England, example, Ring a Ring a Rosies, Tissue a Tissue we all fall down, that's known to come from the Great Plague.
Yes.
And so on. It was a common thing. Well, of course, they had to make their own entertainment. And with Jinny the Witch's fame spread throughout the island like wildfire, and you just imagine the children gathered round the fireside of a night, and their parents be telling them of her, and these incredible happenings, and they wouldn't, as I say, they wouldn't have any entertainment, and each time they'd be repeated, a bit more would be added to, and
Yes.
the whole thing. Well, long may it continue. It makes our island so unique, and
Hop tune it is. Now, you must have scoured out a few turnips in your time
my
as well.
goodness, yes. You know, when you were sitting on a bale in the cow house, in the warm cow house, and you'd be given an old blunt knife so you wouldn't cut. As a child, you would be given an old blunt knife so you wouldn't cut yourself, or a spoon. And usually you'd have to end up resorting to your parents to have to finish it for you.
Yeah.
But it used to be so annoying having the candles blowing out in the
That's right,
turnip.
they do.
And but I don't think any child in the country anyway will ever forget the smell of the hot turnip cooking above the candle.
Yes.
It is a part of the childhood, and long may it continue.
Hop Junay, tra-la-lay. Winnie the Witch went over the house to get the stick to beat the mouse.
The fascinating facts about Jinny the Witch, Janie Lowney, as revealed to us by Hampton Creer. This has been Time to Remember, and there'll be more Manx Memories at the same time next week.